1,200,000 pounds of 1941 steel just came through a grade crossing at 60 miles an hour, and the ground moved before the sound did. The men in Cheyenne call it Big Boy, built the year before Pearl Harbor, still running. I'll stand behind this claim. No diesel locomotive built since has matched this machine's horsepower, not one. Big Boy produces better than 6,000 horsepower at speed, 6,290, measured at the drawbar, the number Union Pacific's own engineers stood behind. Today's standard freight diesel, the workhorse hauling your groceries across Nebraska right now, tops out around 4,400. That's not nostalgia talking. Twice, in the 1990s, the industry tried to build a 6,000 horsepower diesel to close that gap. Twice, the engines couldn't hold together at that output, and both manufacturers quietly walked the number back down. We'll get to exactly why. For now, the number stands, unbeaten, 85 years running. Look at what's producing it. 4 cylinders, 16 driving wheels split across 2 engines under one boiler. A firebox the size of a small bedroom, running near 3,000 degrees. The frame is hinged in the middle, articulated, in the trade language, because nothing rigid could drag a machine this long around a mountain curve. Men who fired it called it a beast, because that's precisely what it was built to be. And a beast this size does not go quietly. Before this film is over, you'll meet the 3 men riding in its cab the day it went down on its side at 50 miles an hour, because for all its muscle, this machine could still be killed by something as small as an unlocked switch. The arc of it is simple, and it's the whole reason you're watching. Built to conquer one mountain. Declared obsolete by men with adding machines, left to rot in a parking lot for 52 years, and then, against every rule of how old iron is supposed to end, it came back, and it is still stronger than what replaced it. So hold on to the question sitting underneath this whole story. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? Not because we couldn't build them again, because somewhere along the way, we stopped wanting to. Part 1. The grade that ate helper engines. 70 years after the Golden Spike joined 2 railroads at Promontory, Utah, the Union Pacific still had a problem it couldn't spike its way out of. East of Ogden, the track climbs into the Wasatch Range at a grade of 1.14%, modest on paper, brutal in practice. On a main line built to move a nation's freight, that grade was a wall, and not the kind you could see coming from 50 miles out. The Wasatch climbs in a long, grinding series of curves and cuts through Red Rock Canyon country, gaining elevation a few feet at a time, until a train that started the day on flat desert found itself climbing towards 7,000 feet without ever crossing anything that looked, from a car window, like a mountain pass. A train that ran flat out across the Nebraska prairie hit that wall and stalled. So the railroad did what railroads had always done. It doubled up. 2 locomotives, sometimes 3, coupled ahead of a single train just to drag it over one stretch of mountain. Then those extra engines had to be uncoupled, turned, and walked back down to wait for the next train behind them. Helper districts, the crews called them. Ogden was one end. Green River, Wyoming sat at the other, roughly 176 miles east, and everything between belonged to the grade. Union Pacific had already tried to solve this once, with brute force instead of a new design. In the years after the First World War, the railroad ran 2 880 compound mallets over this same grade. Big articulated engines in their own right, plenty of muscle for starting a heavy train from a dead stop. But a compound mallet built for starting power couldn't hold a sustained road speed once it crested a summit, and a locomotive that can drag a train up a mountain but can't do anything useful with it afterward isn't solving the mountain problem. It's just relocating it, 10 miles down the line. Picture what that meant on an ordinary night, the kind that never made a headline because nothing about it was unusual. 2 locomotives coupled ahead of a loaded freight, pulling out of Ogden into the dark toward the grade. The fireman on the lead engine watches his gauge climb toward 300 pounds and holds it there, because there's no slack in the schedule for a locomotive running short on steam halfway up this hill. A few miles into the climb, the rail underfoot turns from dry to frost-slick, the way it does most nights from November through March, and the drivers on the trailing engines start to slip, a half-second loss of bite between iron and iron that an experienced hand feels through the floor of the cab before he ever sees it on a gauge. The engineer eases the throttle back rather than force it, because forcing a slipping driver at speed can shear a rod, and losing half a mile an hour on purpose beats losing the whole train off the grade. The coupling between the lead engine and the cars behind it carries a load that can snap a lesser fitting. Men felt it, a shudder running the length of the train each time the slack pulled taut on a hill. By the time both engines finally crest the summit, the crews have spent 2 hours, sometimes 3, finishing a job that flat prairie railroading could close out in 20 minutes. Then the helper engine cuts loose, runs light back down the mountain it just fought its way up, and does the same job again before sunrise. This was the helper district, functioning exactly as designed, at the outer edge of what steam power could manage without something bigger behind the throttle. It was expensive help, too. Every helper engine needed its own crew, its own coal, its own maintenance, its own trip back down the hill for nothing but the return. Multiply that across every train, every day, on a route carrying the bulk of Union Pacific's transcontinental freight, and the railroad was paying, in effect, for locomotives that spent half their working life going the wrong direction. By 1940, Union Pacific President William Jeffers had had enough of doing it the expensive way. Jeffers was a rough hand who'd started as a call boy and clawed his way to the top office, and he wasn't a man for committee meetings. Men who worked under him described a boss who trusted somebody who'd worked with his own hands over somebody who managed from behind a desk. He handed the job to Otto Jabelmann, his vice president of research and mechanical standards, a Cheyenne native who'd started as a shop laborer himself and studied engineering at Stanford and Michigan on his way up. Jeffers's instruction was blunt: build something that can take the Wasatch grade alone. No helpers. No splitting the train. One machine, one crew, the whole mountain. Jabelmann's team looked at what they already had, the 4664 Challenger, a big articulated engine, good but not good enough, and started stretching it, adding a bigger firebox, a longer boiler, 4 more driving wheels bolted onto a frame already carrying 16. The target, on paper, was brutal in its simplicity: pull a 3,600-ton train over that mountain without a single helper at a tractive effort of at least 135,000 pounds. There was a hard ceiling on how they could get there, too. Union Pacific capped the load on each driving axle at just under 68,000 pounds, because anything heavier would crush the rail and roadbed underneath it. Jabelmann's engineers couldn't simply pile on more weight for more traction. They had to find 135,000 pounds of pulling power inside a weight limit the track itself imposed. The kind of constraint that either breaks a design team or forces its best work out of them. Nothing in America had ever been built to that spec. Alco's shop in Schenectady, New York, took the order in 1940. Nobody there had built anything this size before either. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? We hadn't started yet. In 1940, Union Pacific was about to build the strongest one there ever was. It just didn't exist yet. That's next, Part 2, 25 monsters, built with war coming. Design took roughly 6 months. Construction took another 6. 1 year, start-to-finished locomotive, for a machine unlike anything the American rail industry had attempted. Alco's Schenectady shop turned steel and forgings into the first big boy, engine number 4000, and delivered it to Union Pacific at Omaha on September 4, 1941. 20 more followed that year, numbered 4000 through 4019. 3 years later, with the war demanding every ton of freight capacity the country could muster, the War Production Board authorized 5 more, 4020 through 4024, built slightly heavier, same bones. 25 engines total, every one built by men in one shop in upstate New York, most of whom would never see the mountains their machines were built to fight. The final 5 carried slightly heavier boilers and rods than the first 20, small refinements from 3 years of hard lessons on the mountain, but every one of the 25 shared the same bones, the same wheel arrangement, the same job. Somewhere on that shop floor, a worker chalked 2 words on the smokebox of engine 4000, Big Boy. Union Pacific's official name for the class was going to be Wasatch, after the range it was built to beat. Nobody remembers the worker's name. Everybody remembers what he wrote. The name became bigger than anyone at Alco could have predicted. By one newspaper's count, Engine 4000 was written up more than 500 times across 45 states before it ever touched Union Pacific Rail. An untested locomotive already famous on the strength of its size alone. Every big boy that followed carried a Hancock long bell whistle, a deep 3-chime steamboat voice that railroad men could pick out of a yard full of ordinary locomotives with their eyes closed. You heard a big boy coming before you saw it, and once you'd heard it, you didn't mistake it for anything else again. The machine those men built weighed 1.2 million pounds, fully loaded, engine and tender stretching past 132 feet. 16 driving wheels split into 2 engines under one boiler, hinged at the middle so the whole assembly could bend through a curve without leaving the rail. That hinge is the articulated in every technical description you'll read, a $5 word for a blunt idea. Build it too long to be rigid, so let it bend. One number is worth sitting with. Stood on its tail, engine and tender together would clear a 13-story building. Every dimension on this machine was scaled to the mountain, not to the men who'd have to run it. Strip away the size, and the mechanism underneath is the same one every steam locomotive uses, just built to a scale nobody had tried before. Burn fuel in the firebox. Boil water in the tubes running the length of the boiler. Force that steam, at 300 pounds of pressure, into 4 cylinders. Let the cylinders drive the pistons drive the main rods, and the main rods turn 16 driving wheels split across 2 separate engines riding under one frame. Simple, the way a chain is simple, right up until you ask one link in it to survive forces that had broken every locomotive built before it. The 4-cylinder layout alone was a small miracle of packaging. Enough steam passage to feed an engine this size without the pipework itself becoming the bottleneck, on a frame already carrying more weight than any locomotive frame in American history. The first real test came fast and came honest. No fanfare, no ribbon. Engine 4000 backed onto a train of 3,500 tons for a run east out of Ogden, just under its rated capacity of 3,600. Whatever this engine could do, on a real mountain, in front of real witnesses, was about to become public record. A locomotive on paper is a promise. A locomotive on the Wasatch grade, under full load, in front of the men who'd run it for the next 20 years, is a fact. The firemen brought the pressure up to 300 pounds before they'd even left the yard, and held it there through the first miles of level track, because there would be no recovering lost pressure once the grade started climbing under them. Then the rail tilted upward, the exhaust beat quickened, and 3,500 tons of freight came up against 1.14% of Utah mountainside behind a locomotive that had never done this before in its life. It made the climb. Not flawlessly, early reports noted the engine ran slightly under what the engineers had promised on paper, a gap Jobelman's team spent months tuning out. But it made the climb. Alone, without a single helper coupled ahead of it. A grade that had eaten locomotives in pairs for 70 years had just been beaten by one machine on its first real day of work. The men who'd live with that machine for the next 2 decades weren't in the design room. They were in the cab. Every big boy carried a crew of 3, engineer, fireman, brakeman, with room for a couple more if the trip called for it. The fireman's job, even with a mechanical stoker doing the heavy work of feeding the firebox, meant riding beside a fire running upward of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, in a cab with no air conditioning, watching a boiler pressure gauge that had to hold at 300 pounds per square inch for the whole run, or the whole trip stopped meaning anything. In summer, that cab turned into an oven on wheels. In a Wyoming winter, the same crew rode with one side scorched by the firebox and the other side numb from wind through open cab windows at 40 miles an hour. Men like the ones who worked the roundhouse at Ogden and the yard at Cheyenne learned to dress for both extremes on the same 8-hour shift, because the job demanded both. None of it was optional, and none of it forgave a bad guess. A fireman who let the water level in the boiler run low for even a few minutes risked exposing the crown sheet, the flat steel roof of the firebox, to red-hot metal no longer covered by water, which is the single fastest way to destroy a steam locomotive and everyone standing near it when it happens. Watching that water glass was the difference between an ordinary Tuesday and a catastrophe, not busy work, and every fireman who rode a big boy understood that in his hands before anybody had to explain it to him in words. I've stood inside that firebox with the fire out and the metal gone cold, and even dead, it tells you what it used to hold. You don't forget it. Not every man who climbed into that cab walked back down. We'll get to that. For now, understand what these crews were running. A machine that could outpull anything else on the property, kept alive by men who trusted 300 pounds of steam pressure with their lives, every shift, 20 years running. By the time the last of the 25 rolled out of Schenectady in 1944, the class had already proven the bet. One machine could do the work of 2, sometimes 3. The helper districts didn't vanish overnight, but on the Wasatch grade, for the first time in the railroad's history, one crew and one locomotive owned the mountain. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? We hadn't started stopping yet. In 1944, Union Pacific was still building more of them. That's how sure they were. This was the answer. Keep that in mind, because sure didn't last. Part 3. The engine that never fired a shot. By December of 1941, the mission changed. The mountain was beaten, the war was the new enemy, and Big Boy would fight it on the only front open to a locomotive, the rail line. The Wasatch route carried war freight toward the Pacific, steel, ordnance, fuel, and eventually men. In numbers, the peacetime railroad had never had to move. If that line stalled, ships didn't get loaded, and the Pacific Campaign felt it within days. Big Boy fired nothing at anyone. It hauled everything that let other men fire theirs. There was no slack built into that schedule, and no room for a locomotive breakdown to become a strategic problem. But that's exactly what a breakdown on this single stretch of mountain could become. A supply line to an entire theater of war, running through one grade in Utah that the peacetime railroad had once needed 3 locomotives just to survive. The war didn't just strain the machines, it strained the men who ran them. With so many career railroaders gone into uniform, Union Pacific found itself training replacement crews it would never have hired in peacetime. Men exempted from combat service or past the usual hiring age, put into cabs to keep the freight moving. One detail surprised even Union Pacific. Big Boy turned out to be forgiving enough that a novice fireman could do a fair job on it within a few weeks, which nobody expected from the largest steam locomotive in the world. That the class ran as reliably as it did through the war years, under crews with a fraction of the normal experience behind them, says plenty about how well Jobelman's team had built the thing in the first place. That's the record that earned the class its final 5 locomotives in 1944, authorized by the War Production Board at a moment when Washington controlled every ounce of steel in the country. When the government decides your machine is worth building more of in the middle of a global war, that's not sentiment. That's a machine that had already proven its worth in the only kind of combat it would ever see. Each of the 25 cost Union Pacific about $265,000 to build, north of $4 million today. Expensive, on the invoice. Cheap against the alternative. A single Big Boy on the Wasatch grade replaced 2 or 3 helper locomotives and their crews, their coal, their maintenance, their empty trips back down the mountain. Run that math across 20 years and 25 locomotives, and the machine that looked expensive on delivery day turned into the cheap one before its first decade was out. The men who kept it running earned every dollar of that math. A three-man crew took 600 tons through Wyoming winters and Utah summers, watching gauges that had no room for a bad guess. In the mid-1940s, Union Pacific even bolted smoke deflectors onto one engine in the class, trying to keep exhaust out of the cab on certain runs. The fix didn't take. Better nozzle design solved the real problem within a year, and the deflectors came off. But the fact that they tried it says plenty about what riding behind that firebox felt like, hour after hour, on a machine that never stopped being a furnace with wheels underneath it. Winter added its own toll, separate from anything the fire could do to a man. Sherman Hill in a Wyoming January could drop past 30 below with wind behind it, and a brakeman's job put him outside the cab in that cold, walking the tops of freight cars, setting hand brakes, checking couplings, work that couldn't be done from inside a heated cab, no matter how badly a man might have wanted it to be. Frostbite was a routine winter injury on this stretch of railroad, not a rare one. The machine could shrug off weather that could take a man's fingers. The record does not show something you might expect it to. Search for a documented case of a big boy boiler failing catastrophically, a crown sheet letting go, the kind of explosion that killed men on lesser-built engines throughout the steam era, and you will not find one. In 18 years of revenue service across 25 locomotives, the boiler held every time. In the one fully documented case where a big boy crew paid with their lives, the machine itself never turned on them. The cause was somebody else's mistake. 600 tons of moving steel doing exactly what physics does when it leaves the rail at speed. April 27, 1953. Red Desert, Wyoming, open, empty country between Rawlins and Green River, the kind of landscape where a train runs flat and fast for miles with nothing to slow it. Engine 4005, hauling 62 freight cars and a caboose. In the cab, engineer Leo Murray, fireman Lawrence Endres, and head brakeman James Anderton, 36 years old, a World War II veteran with a wife and 2 young children waiting in Rawlins. 8 miles up the line, a section gang had been working a switch. Whatever happened between that gang and the next train through, the switch was left unaligned, and no warning reached the cab in time. 4005 hit the open switch at 50 miles an hour. The engine left the rails, tipped onto its left side, and slid. 600 tons skidding along the roadbed, tearing up track and ties as it went. The tender 40 tons of coal and water riding directly behind the cab drove forward into the space where the crew stood. The first 18 cars derailed behind it, a dozen of them piled into wreckage 70 feet high, cargo scattered across the desert floor, tractors, dead hogs, typewriters, sewing machines, the ordinary freight of an ordinary Monday, thrown across the sand like nobody's yard sale. Murray and Endres died instantly. Anderton, pinned in the wreckage, held on while rescue crews worked for hours to free him, hampered by wreckage that pinned him in a position nobody could safely work around quickly. It wasn't a lack of effort or a lack of will. The wreck itself made speed impossible, and that is sometimes the cruelest fact a rescue has to accept. He did not survive his injuries. 3 men, 1 machine, 1 afternoon, because a switch that should have been locked wasn't. That's the honest cost, laid flat with no varnish on it. A piece of iron the size of a man's forearm, left in the wrong position, against a locomotive too heavy and too fast to forgive the mistake. They lifted 4005 back onto the rails, straightened what could be straightened, and put it back to work. The machine outlived the men who had been riding it that morning. It usually does. Their names are not forgotten on that stretch of railroad. Every year, a small museum near Rawlins holds a memorial for the 3 of them, Murray, Endres, and Anderton, an event the museum still calls Big Boy Day, more than 70 years after the wreck. Retired engineers who once ran that same locomotive show up. Family still comes. It is a small thing, a local thing, and it is exactly the kind of thing this industry gets right when it remembers to do it at all. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? Not yet, not in 1953. Big Boy was still Union Pacific's answer to the mountain, still hauling more tonnage than anything else on the property. The men who ran it knew exactly what it could do to them if something outside the cab went wrong. They climbed back in anyway, every shift, for 6 more years. That's what the job asked of them, and they gave it. Part 4. Beaten by a ledger, not a locomotive. Diesel-electric power had been creeping onto American railroads since before the war, and by the early 1950s, it had stopped creeping and started winning. A single Big Boy could still outpull anything with a diesel horn on it in 1950, so strength was never the diesel's argument. Its argument was written in a ledger, not on a dynamometer chart. A diesel didn't need water. Big Boy drank roughly 200 gallons a mile and had to stop for more every 100 miles or so, alongside boiler washes that pulled the machine out of revenue service for hours at a stretch. A diesel didn't need a fireman. One fewer skilled position on the payroll multiplied across every locomotive, every shift, every year. A diesel could be kept running by crews with less specialized training than it took to hold a reciprocating steam engine's rods, valves, and boiler tubes within tolerance. Add up the maintenance hours alone, and the comparison turns uncomfortable fast. A steam locomotive needed boiler washouts, flue cleaning, and constant running gear inspection from a small army of skilled boilermakers and machinists just to stay certified to carry pressure. A diesel needed an oil change and a walk-around. Multiply that gap across a fleet of hundreds of locomotives, and the real choice was never between two machines. It was between two entirely different labor forces, and the smaller one was cheaper every single quarter. None of it made the diesel stronger, but by the mid-1950s, cheaper to own was the only argument that mattered in a railroad boardroom. I won't pretend otherwise, because this audience will catch me if I do. The diesel math was real. Fuel efficiency, water stop time, maintenance hours, crew costs, every column favored the new machine, and Union Pacific's accountants weren't wrong to read them that way. But cheaper and better are two different words, and somewhere in the transition from steam to diesel, the railroad industry let those two words start meaning the same thing. They never were. There's an irony worth naming here, because it makes the story more honest, not less. Big Boy itself was built on cost logic, fewer, bigger locomotives instead of a whole fleet of small helper engines, because one large machine running efficiently beat 3 small machines running redundantly. Union Pacific's mechanical department had believed in that math since 1941. The diesel didn't bring a new argument to the railroad, it just won the same argument Big Boy had already won once, using a cheaper machine to do it. No single memo survives with one executive's name signed at the bottom, ordering Big Boy's death. What survives instead is the date. By the summer of 1959, the class had made its last runs in revenue freight service, 18 years after the first one rolled out of Schenectady into a mountain nobody thought one machine could beat alone. That same year, 1959, Union Pacific's own publicity department released a short film about the class called Last of the Giants, already elegizing the machine in the same season the railroad was pulling it from active service. The company knew exactly what it was retiring, even while the accountants made the case for retiring it. Over the next few years, one by one, they came off the roster. Engine 4014, the machine you saw pass through that grade crossing at the top of this film, was formally struck from the roster in December of 1961 after logging more than 1 million miles across 18 years of work. Union Pacific donated it to a museum in Pomona, California, and that, as far as anyone in 1961 had reason to believe, was the end of the story. Time to correct something you've probably read. Plenty of sources will tell you Big Boy produced 7,000 horsepower, flat out, no qualification. The real number is more precise and more interesting. The verified figure, measured at the drawbar at 41 miles an hour, the number Union Pacific's own engineers stood behind, is 6,290 horsepower. Other sources cite higher numbers at different speeds and different measurement points. None of that changes the number that matters for what comes next. Because here's the comparison this whole film has been walking toward. Today's standard freight diesel, the workhorse units hauling intermodal and grain trains across this country right now, run around 4,400 horsepower. That's a solid, well-engineered number in its own right. It's also nearly 2,000 horsepower short of what a 1941 steam locomotive produced. And before the rail fans in the comments jump on me, yes, the industry tried to close that gap. Twice in the 1990s, two manufacturers built 6,000 horsepower diesels specifically to reach for big boy class output in a single unit. General Electric built the AC 6000 CW. Electromotive built the SD90 Mac. Both were real, both got sold to real railroads, and both manufacturers ran out of reliability before they ran out of ambition. Engines that vibrated themselves into failure at that output, until both companies quietly derated their own locomotives back down to around 4,400 horsepower, the same number every other standard diesel was already running. One detail Union Pacific might not love me pointing out: this same railroad was one of the buyers of the AC 6000 CW. Union Pacific ran them, and when the big engines proved unreliable at full rated output, Union Pacific downgraded its own fleet's power the same way everyone else did. The railroad that once built the strongest locomotive in the world later owned some of the diesels that tried and failed to match it, and had to admit as much on a spec sheet. Give diesel its due because it earned it. It's cheaper to run, lighter on crew, and it doesn't need a water tower every 100 miles. Union Pacific's own steam crew will tell you the same thing plainly. Steam lost the argument on efficiency, not on strength. Plain engineering, not spin. Strength was never the fight diesel won. Cost was. And on raw output, at the wheel, nothing built in the 85 years since Big Boy's delivery has matched it. There's a second number that matters more than the horsepower fight. Big Boy is 85 years old, and it is, right now, under steam, crossing state lines. A modern freight diesel gets rebuilt or scrapped somewhere between 15 and 20 years into its working life. Good machines, built to a schedule, built to be replaced. Big Boy was built to be repaired forever. Diesel technology has improved enormously since the 1950s, and today's units are far more reliable than their early ancestors, but that improvement hasn't moved the retirement clock much. 15 to 20 years remains the ordinary working life of a mainline freight diesel, replaced not because it failed, but because the schedule said it was time. Somewhere between 1941 and today, the industry stopped building for forever and started building for the next 15 years. The new locomotives aren't lesser machines, and the men and women running them aren't lesser railroaders than the ones who fired steam. They're just running equipment that was never asked to last 85 years because nobody thought it needed to. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? You have most of the answer now. The ability never left. What left was the willingness to pay for it. And once something gets priced out, the ledger doesn't remember horsepower, only cost per mile. Part 5. 52 years asleep, and then it woke up anyway. Engine 4014 sat at the Rail Giants Museum on the Los Angeles County Fairgrounds in Pomona, California, for 52 years, static and cold, a monument instead of a machine. Kids climbed the running boards on school field trips. Birds nested where a fireman used to stand. The boiler that once held 300 pounds of pressure for 18 straight years held nothing at all. That's usually where these stories end. A plaque, a parking lot, a slow surrender to weather. Big Boy's story kept going. In 2013, Union Pacific reacquired the locomotive from the museum. Word went to the railroad's small, specialized steam program led by a man named Ed Dickens, senior manager of Union Pacific Heritage Operations, and, more to the point, a steam locomotive engineer and mechanic who had already rebuilt one of the railroad's other historic machines. Getting 4014 out of that fairground parking lot wasn't a simple hookup and haul. Crews dragged the dead locomotive across 40-foot sections of temporary track with a wheel loader, leapfrogging each panel to the front more than 20 times just to reach a real rail line. Then diesel power, 4 units strong, because a dead steam locomotive doesn't roll easy, pulled it out onto the main line for the first time in over half a century, bound for Cheyenne, Wyoming, 1,300 miles away. It arrived that May. What followed was years of work most restorations never attempt. Dickens and his crew didn't cosmetically freshen a museum piece. They took a working steam locomotive apart down to its components, hoisted the boiler off the frame, split the front engine from the rear for inspection, found what 52 years of static display had hidden from view. "There are parts of a locomotive you can't properly inspect until it's in motion," Dickens said at the time. And that line tells you the whole gap between restoring something to look right and restoring something to actually run. The crew converted the firebox from coal to oil, added modern safety systems no 1940s crew ever had, and pressure-tested the rebuilt boiler to 375 pounds per square inch, 25% over its working rating, because nobody puts steam behind a boiler they aren't certain will hold. Cheyenne's steam shop is one of the last facilities left anywhere on the American rail network, still staffed and tooled to rebuild a locomotive of this size from the frame outward. Boilermakers, machinists, and pipefitters practicing trades the mainline industry stopped training for generations ago, kept alive at this one shop almost out of institutional stubbornness. Every other railroad in the country long since let those skills retire, along with the steam locomotives they used to serve. Even after the rebuild, this machine has never been simple to run. 2 weeks into its first excursion season, drifting through a rail yard in Rawlins, Wyoming at walking speed, 2 of its axles dropped off the rail in a minor derailment. The kind of thing that happens to 80-year-old iron meeting track built for lighter, newer equipment. Dickens's crew and the local track gang had it back on the rail and moving again within a few hours, using wood blocking to walk the drivers back into place, the same low-tech trick railroaders have used for a century. No injuries, minimal damage, and the tour rolled on the next day. The danger this machine carried never fully retired. It just changed shape, from a switch left open in 1953 to an old frame meeting new track in 2019. I've talked to men on that restoration crew, and every one of them says the same thing about the day they finally lit the fire for real. Nobody breathed easy until the pressure gauge started climbing the way it was supposed to. Everyone on that crew understood what was riding on the next few hours. 5 years of work, thousands of labor hours, and a locomotive's entire second life all came down to whether pressure would hold in a boiler nobody had fired in 60 years. The night of May 1st, 2019, they walked Big Boy out of the Cheyenne Roundhouse under its own power for the first time since its final revenue run, 6 decades earlier. No fanfare that night, just a machine finding out whether 60 years of sitting still had cost it anything. It hadn't. The next morning, they opened the throttle for a real test run out to Greeley, Colorado and back. The first miles this locomotive had covered under its own power since Eisenhower's first term in office. Within days, 4014 was in Ogden, Utah, standing beside living legend engine 844 to mark the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, the same stretch of rail, 70 years after Union Pacific first built a locomotive to conquer the mountain beside it. More than 1 million people came out that season. Not rail fans alone, grandfathers who'd worked the yards, sons who'd never seen steam outside a photograph, people standing at grade crossings in 100 degrees of heat just to feel a 1941 machine go by at speed one more time. The symmetry here is the whole point of this story, told in 2 sentences. In 1941, a crew of 3 kept this machine alive with their hands on the throttle, the injector, and the fire, reading gauges and trusting steam, 20 years running. In 2019, a different crew kept it alive with torque wrenches, ultrasonic testing, and a level of documentation the original builders never dreamed they'd need. The men never met. The machine is the one both of them touched. Big Boy hasn't stopped since. Dickens's crew has toured it year after year, the transcontinental sesquicentennial in 2019, a 12-state run across the West, and this year, for America's 250th birthday, its biggest journey yet, a coast-to-coast tour out of Cheyenne, through the Sacramento Valley and back, then east, across the whole country to Philadelphia, and home again. Along the way, the crew stopped every 100 miles or so to oil the running gear by hand, the same maintenance ritual steam railroading has always demanded, on a schedule almost nobody in modern freight service still keeps for any other locomotive on the continent. For this tour, the railroad painted it white, with white-wall tires on the pilot truck and a gold eagle mounted above the headlight. A locomotive built for a war now dressed for a birthday, and somehow it wore both looks like they belonged to it. Crowds lined the tracks in towns that hadn't heard a steam whistle in 70 years. In more than one of those towns, people cried. Not because a train went by, because something they'd been told was gone came back anyway, and it was exactly as strong as they remembered. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? By 2019, the question had picked up an uncomfortable third answer, sitting right alongside we didn't need to, and we chose cheaper. We never lost the ability. One machine, kept alive by stubbornness and skill instead of a spreadsheet, just proved it. That's the answer the ledger never accounted for. Close. Still the strongest thing on the railroad. That's the full answer to the question I asked you back at the top of this film. Why did we stop building the strongest machines we ever made? Not because we couldn't build them again. Because somewhere along the way, we stopped wanting to. Otto Jobelmann's team proved in 1941 that a single machine could beat any mountain on the continent, and nobody has beaten that number since. Not with 6,000 horsepower diesels in the 90s, not with anything running today. Jeffers wanted one machine that could own a mountain outright, and Jabelmann's team delivered exactly that, on the first real attempt, in under a year. That part of the story has never needed defending. We stopped because somewhere in the accounting, strength quietly stopped being what the railroad was buying. Say the comparison once more, plainly, because it's the whole reason this machine has earned 85 years of anybody's attention. A locomotive built the year before Pearl Harbor still outproduces, at the wheel, every standard freight diesel rolling across this country today. The engineers who tried to beat that number with newer technology couldn't make it hold together. The number just sits there, unbothered, 85 years and counting. I want to be careful with the ending, because this was never a story about modern machines being lesser. The diesels doing the work today are good, honest, well-built machines, and the men and women running them carry the same pride their grandfathers carried in a steam cab. The real trouble here is disposability, not the diesel. A decision, made somewhere along the way, to stop building things meant to outlast the people who built them. 1941 built a machine to be repaired forever. Somewhere after that, the industry started building machines to be replaced on schedule. The new ones are good machines. They're just not built to be loved for 85 years, and that's no insult to them. It's simply not what they were built for. Big Boy was asked to be that. One machine, one mountain, built to last, and it outlived every argument anybody made for retiring it, including the diesel that finally did retire it. This year, it crossed the whole country it once helped move to war, dressed in white and gold for a birthday it was never built to see. Built for one mountain, now it crosses all of them. If you ever stood trackside for steam, if you've got a memory of a whistle, a grandfather who fired one of these, a town your family's from that steam used to run through, put it in the comments. This channel exists because of stories like that, and this one is for the men who never got to see their machine come home. There's another old machine out there that never should have won. Next time, I'll tell you how it did.